Hello and welcome. This is my first time to do a Facebook Live, so I'm really excited. I look kind of tired. It's been a long day, but I'm excited to be here. I know I did a video a couple weeks ago about a presentation I went to on Winnie Dunn, and she talked about sensory processing. And so I kind of want to just do some updates on that and just talk to you guys really about what sensory processing is. A lot of people hear different terms about sensory processing. They'll hear like sensory integration, they'll hear sensory preferences, sensory emotional regulation, sensory integration, sensory, all kinds of different things, terms that they'll hear. And I kind of want to just talk about what the most recent literature says about sensory processing, and the most recent literature calls it sensory processing. And so what Winnie Dunn does is she talks about it in terms of as a preference versus something that we're going to fix in a child. It's really looking at, it's just a way to get to know the child and also know yourself, to know what is your preference, just to help you understand how you're setting up your environment if you're in the classroom or if you're at home, just knowing what is your preference versus what is the preference of maybe your children or your students. And so they talk about it in terms of two major themes for sensory processing. The first is regulation. And so the first is threshold. So it looks at a neurological threshold. So two main terms, you have threshold and you have self-regulation. Threshold is a neurological term. It just means how much sensory information needed in order to trigger a response. And so we think about thresholds in terms of big thresholds or small thresholds. So some people have big thresholds, meaning they need a lot of sensory input in order to have a behavior to happen. And some might need smaller thresholds. They might have a smaller tolerance for different types of sensory information. So we have sensory thresholds, and then we have neurological thresholds, and then we also have what's called self-regulation. And so self-regulation is what we do on our part to trigger a response to happen. So you have a threshold. For those of you guys just joining us, thanks for joining. I'm talking about sensory processing, and really sensory processing is the way we take in information, sensory information, and what we do with it. Okay, and so it's not something that we look at changing. It's not something that we're trying to change the brain. It's just getting an idea about what our preferences are for sensory information. And so the two main terms are thresholds. So a threshold is the amount of sensory input that you need. And then you also have self-regulation, and that's what you do to, in response to your threshold size. And so you can put sensory processing into 4 different categories. And so I'm going to just briefly talk about those. I'll talk about them later on other trainings. But you really look at kids in terms of their threshold. So I think about it in terms of maybe like bucket sizes. So some kids have large buckets and they need lots and lots of information, and some kids have smaller buckets. So some kids have a small bucket or threshold where they don't need a whole lot of information, or they're gonna lose it. They're gonna have a meltdown. They're gonna have a hard time attending. And so we think about kids: do they have a big threshold or do they have a small threshold? And then we think about, what are they doing to try to fill that threshold? Are they trying to actively get information, or are they trying to escape from some of the sensory information that's going on because of their small threshold? So the 4 categories that you have, the first one is what we call a sensory seeker. And a sensory seeker is a child. It's kind of like a Tigger if you compare them to Winnie Pooh characters. A sensory seeker is a child or an individual who has a large threshold. So they need a lot of sensory information, and they're doing everything they can to fill that up. So these are going to be your busybodies. These are going to be the people who are the kids who are constantly moving around, constantly needing new and novel experiences in order to trigger that response, in order to have that behavior response. So these are the kids that are trying to fill their bucket, and they need lots of information. So these kids are going to need your help in helping them every situation is going to have to be different and novel. They're going to have to move around more. They're going to need to study in environments that have lots of things going on versus, just being in a really still, quiet environment. That's going to drive them crazy. I'm definitely a sensory seeker. I need lots of things going on in order to help me focus. So that's your first category. So we have 4 of them. The first one is the sensory seekers. They have a big registration, so they need lots of input, and they're trying to fill up their bucket. So they're going to need some ways to get more information, to get more sensory input. The next one is going to be, I'm going to talk about the registration. So registration kids are kids that also have large thresholds, like your seekers, but they're not doing anything to try to fill up their bucket. So I saw a kid like this yesterday, and what he did is he just melted into his seat. So when he didn't have information going on, he's like an Eeyore. He just melted. And he's kind of kid that seems kind of lazy, but they just mold into whatever's going on. And so they need lots of input, but they're not trying to get it. So they're going to have to treat them like you do a tigger or a seeker, and you're going to have to find ways to give them more sensory input, or you're going to lose them. These are the kids that are just like unaware of anything that's going on in the environment. So they are kind of out to lunch and just dazed and miss everything, unaware of everything that's going on. So you're going to have to find ways to help them fill up their bucket. The next one would be your sensory avoiders. So these are going to be, we talked about the 2 kids with the seekers and the registration have the big buckets. These 2 have the small buckets. So the avoiders and sensitive. So the avoiders, these are the ones who are active. They have small thresholds, and they're actively moving around, and they're actively moving, and they're going to, these are the kids that are going to be distracted, and they're avoiding everything that can happen, right? They're trying to not let their bucket overflow because it's small. So they are actively trying to avoid any kinds of sensory input. And so these are the kids that you're going to have to think about. They have a small threshold for sensory information, and that you're going to have to give them some structured opportunities. Sorry, I got to charge my phone. Some structured opportunities. But these are the kids that are going to need predictability. You're going to need to give them the schedules, and you're going to have to prepare them for any kind of new thing that's coming up. Okay, otherwise, if you let their bucket overflow, you're going to lose them and they're going to have meltdowns. Okay, the 4th one is going to be your sensitivity. So these are the kids that are sensitive. They have a small threshold for sensory information, just like your avoiders. Okay, they have a low threshold and they are trying to participate, but they are distracted by everything that's going on. Okay, so instead of avoiding it and not doing it, they are all over the place. They're looking around. They are paying attention to every little thing, but their threshold is small, and so they're not focusing. They're not able to participate when a lot of things are going around, because you look at providing intervention for kids based on the size of their threshold. So for kids that have big thresholds, you provide them with more information in a structured way. So that's your seekers and your registration, your Eeyores and your Tiggers. For kids that have that small threshold, those are the kids you're looking at that small threshold. They're going to need that predictability. They're going to need structure. And they're going to need to know about transitions, things that are coming up, because that's their threshold. And so I think that some things that you're going to want to really look at when you're, I know some people are just joining us, is really thinking about those thresholds and what helps your kids focus more. Does it help them more when they have more input, or does it distract them more? If it helps them more, then they have large registrations. Big registrations, okay? If they are more distracted when you give them more types of sensory input, that means their threshold is smaller. So they need more structure and less types of sensory information that's going on. So many times I'll do consults in classrooms, and the teachers will say, I've got this student and he's constantly running around. It's like he needs more input. And so I'll talk to them about, I'm like, does he really need more input? Because it seems to me like he's almost avoiding. And so instead of giving him more sensory input, let's give him structure. Like maybe we're just confused in that he really needs less instead of more. And so thinking about really the size of their, like I said, the size of their bucket. Do they have these big buckets or do they have these small buckets? How much sensory information do they need? And I think, also I talk with teachers and parents about this, is really helping people understand their preferences, because your preference will impact how you work with kids and how you set up your classrooms. So knowing that, it's theory of mind, not everybody feels the same as you do. And so I've had to learn myself that I am definitely a sensory seeker. I'm always looking for novel things. I'm wanting to change it up. I'm always this and that. And I have to know when I'm around other people that have lower thresholds, I have to chill out and I have to prepare certain people when changes are coming, more so than what I might need myself. And so there's some great tools out there on understanding like just your sensory preferences for yourself. And then there's what's called the sensory profile. So for you, I know we have some teachers on here. If you are having some questions about some of your students, get in touch with me or another occupational therapist to do a sensory profile. And a sensory profile, it's not necessarily a diagnostic tool. So there's not a medical diagnosis for sensory processing. Okay, there's nothing that you can say, yes, they have a sensory issue or they don't have a sensory issue in a medical terms. It's all based on preferences. That's all that it is right now. It's, okay, we know that this child has a preference for this type of sensory information or that type of sensory information. And so you're not going to get that medical diagnosis, but what these tools can do is just help you be aware of their preferences. So another point that I want to make is that you might have kids who have those large thresholds or those big buckets for certain areas, but maybe not other areas. So for an example, food, for example, I'm one, like I told you guys, I'm a seeker. So I like new novel things all the time, unless you're talking about food. And food for me, I am very sensitive. And so I have to have it structured. I have to have it a certain way. I'm kind of picky on what I eat. And so I see that a lot in the kids that I work with too, is that they might have a need for more movement, but then maybe touch, it sets them off. So I can't go up and just tickle them and mess around with them because they're really sensitive in that area. And so it's not like you're all or nothing. It's not like you have a large threshold for everything or a small threshold for everything. It can cross over, and that's what that sensory profile does, is it looks at all the different areas, and it gives you an idea as far as what kind of areas do they have a larger threshold for and what kind of areas do they have a smaller threshold for. And it helps you then kind of see what those preferences are and maybe how you need to change up a little bit maybe in your classroom or at home in order to help just meet those needs. You're not changing it. So you're not changing the way the brain works. We all have preferences. It's the way we are. We're not doing that. We are just adapting the environment to support those preferences is what we're doing, which is what we've done to ourselves as adults. That's how I structure my day. I know I need things going on. I can't be in the same place all day long. That's why my job is going different places. I know that about myself. And so we automatically kind of do that anyway to help us best perform. But for our kids, especially for our kids that have a lot of challenging behavior, we really need to help set up our environment to help them be more successful based on some of their sensory preferences. So do you guys have any questions? If you do, you can post them in the comments and I'll try to answer them. Or if you have any other topics that you'd like me to address about sensory processing, I would love to. It's my first Facebook Live. It's been kind of fun. I thought I could do it from my computer, but I guess I have to install some software or something. So that's why I'm on my phone now. And my room is kind of dark. Well, thank you guys for joining, and you guys have a great evening, and I'll be doing probably one of these about once or twice a week. Have a great day. Bye.